As you know, Unitarian Universalists don't have a creed. We don't believe that any truth can be set in stone. It's a central tenet of our faith that revelation continues to unfold. Our lack of definitive doctrine can make it difficult sometimes to know what to say when we talk about our shared faith, right? What exactly do we share when we say shared faith? So, in response to that question, 7 principles were written into our denominational bylaws. These are not doctrine, these are observations. When we talk about shared faith, we can say that in general, we agree on these 7 things. To ensure that they don't become doctrinal, those principles are up for review every 15 years. Every 15 years, we ask whether or not these things continue to describe us and whether we still see them as aspirational. I'm telling you this to make sure that we all understand what it means when we say we're talking about an 8th principle. The 8th principle is up for a vote in June by our General Assembly. It was written by Paula Cole-Jones, our guest today. To say it's a huge coup to have Paula here, whether you all know it, whether she knows it or not. I was listening to the other ministers who were preaching on the 8th principle and asking what to say, and I'm like, we've got Paula. So it is really a joy to have her here. I had heard Paula's name many times before I had ever met her. She's a pillar of her faith. But I did finally meet her in 2014. She and I were invited to something called Collaboratory. 3 of our UU institutions brought 30 people they considered UU leaders to Detroit for the better part of a week, with the hope that together we could think about the intersections of environmentalism and racism, and more importantly, to get this conversation on the UU agenda, which wasn't really talking too much about either of those things, but certainly not about this intersection. It was there that Paula handed me a card and told me not to share it with anyone, that she was trusting me with something that meant everything to her. On the card was written the 8th principle. She was at the beginning of a campaign that brought us to this moment. She, with the colleagues she has entrusted and partnered with, has raised up this missing piece and is asking us all to join in carrying it. So I know Megan put a lot of information in the chat. The 8th principle, though, I'll just read it for you. Then we're going to turn this over to Paula. It reads, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote," here it comes, "journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions." After this service, we're going to start a conversation about how we move this principle into our own church life and how we support it in our larger denominational life. So I'm going to turn this over to Paula Cole-Jones, our spiritual guide this morning. Let's see if we can highlight her and unmute her and get her in the center of the room here.
I'm unmuted, and I want to thank you first for the invitation. And Reverend Peggy, Reverend Chris, thank you very much for being fellow journeyers with me. Let me say one thing, two corrections actually before we start. I am a co-author with Bruce Pollock Johnson, who is a member of the Restoration Church in Philadelphia. So together we are kind of building this movement, this campaign. And also the vote will not happen at this General Assembly, so I don't want you to come and be disappointed, but we are working on it. So we are just about 5 years into the new year, 2021, and already volumes of history have been recorded. Actually amazing. There are times when we need a bird's eye view in order to locate this particular moment in which we find ourselves. We are in a long experience of unfinished business that needs to be brought to conclusion in fulfillment of long overdue aspirations and promises. In light of the beloved community, I'm going to reach back 55 years for the bird's eye view. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. addressed Unitarian Universalists as the Ware lecturer at our General Assembly. And he said, quote, "One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. And there can be no denying of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our world today." End quote. He could have written those words just in 2021. As many of you know, Dr. King had a relationship with Unitarian Universalism. He knew us, and he attended from time to time a Unitarian Universalist church in Boston, where Reverend Dr. Dana Greeley served as the minister. Reverend Greeley also served as the president of our association in the 60s. Dr. King inspired and embodied the meaning, the sense of the beloved community. If we are to build a beloved community, we must recognize the systemic and the subtle ways that racism and oppression work to shape our relationships to power, specific issues, and to each other. If we are to build the beloved community, eliminating oppression must be central to our mission and our daily practices as spiritual communities and as activists. Of all that we do, the work of addressing and eliminating oppression is central to Unitarian Universalism. Now, Dr. King spoke of segregation as an evil. And although segregation was to end with the legislation, we all see how the attitudes and the practices that supported segregation continue to support voter suppression, mass incarceration, police brutality, the killings of unarmed people of color, the abuse of migrants, and a myriad of injustices. And just recently, the whole world witnessed an insurrection in an attempt to overthrow the national election and to overthrow the US government. This was about doing harm to elected officials in an effort to deny one of our most basic civil rights, the right to vote. Noam Chomsky said that democracy is a threat to power systems. The president of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, made this claim even more relevant the day after the insurrection when he said, quote, "White supremacy is the greatest threat to democracy, and democracy is the greatest threat to white supremacy," unquote. He says that this is the cause of America's crisis. We have unequal, unjust systems that teeter on our acceptance of systemic racism and oppression. At times, the manifestations are so subtle that many people will not notice them. And sometimes they're so blatant that no amount of reasoning or rationalizing can make them disappear. The evil of segregation that Dr. King spoke of and fought against was just one expression of the larger system of white supremacy. White supremacy is an evil that has been normalized throughout this country's history. It has never adequately been addressed or eradicated, and it's a threat. So evil, how do we talk about it? How do we relate to evil as Unitarian Universalists? I think this is part of our unfinished business too. It is said that Unitarian Universalism does not have a theology of evil, but I'm calling that claim of no theology of evil into question. So let me step back for a moment to provide some perspective on how I see evil through a contemporary lens. I had a personal experience. We don't have enough time for me to relay it to you, but about 5 years ago, I had an experience that led me to a clear belief in the power of collective positive intention and action. This is not a revolutionary idea, but it can have revolutionary results. We watch it in practice constantly, but I don't know that we've really harnessed its power. The profound experience that I had made me stop and pay attention. And I started to wonder, how can we galvanize more of this in our Unitarian Universalist ministries? And then 4 years ago, while I was trying to figure out how to live in a society that was becoming more and more hostile, it was apparent that just as I believed in the power of collective positive intention and action, I must also reckon with its opposite. Now, I don't believe in evil as a supernatural devil or demon, but we have long been confronting the power of collective negative intention and action. This is what our social justice movements are all about: collective power, taking on another source of power that is doing harm to the community. Unitarian Universalists are driven by social justice. It's central to our identity. We have a history of confronting the forces of injustice. Now, we might not use the language of evil, but I think that when we confront injustice, we are putting our theology into action. And in there is a theology of evil that we're expressing by our actions, but not by our words. Why not? It helps to name things. When I first spoke about this 4 years ago, it was because I believed we were not prepared for what was about to come our way. And we weren't. And quite frankly, it was even worse than I thought it would be. So it's time that we name the power of collective negative intention and action and go on to develop that theology of evil. It matters to us. And it matters to the world if this country and our institutions are being run by people with collective power and negative intentions and actions. And we need to understand the spiritual and the structural forces that are at play both in collective negative intention and action as well as the positive intentions and actions. And we can't be passive about this. And we can't assume that it's not happening. We need to be actively engaged in spiritual practices that fulfill our principles and the respect and the inherent worth and dignity of all people and all communities. Now, the 8th principle is a spiritual calling for us to pay attention and to develop ongoing practices for dismantling racism, and oppression. This is how we can fulfill our role in building strong communities around justice and inclusion. It's something that needs to be affirmed far and wide in an emerging culture of white nationalism and authoritarianism. The eighth principle also keeps us relevant in today's world. And we can't want so much for things to be okay that we avoid seeing the work that needs to be done to make it okay. No one is finished with this work. No one is finished with this work. And people who are most negatively impacted by discrimination and injustice in its many forms have been saying for years what needs to change. That's why we march and rally to raise the level of awareness of injustices that are deeply affecting our communities. That's why we had the labor movement around economic injustice, the civil rights movements around racial injustice, the women's movement. We had Stonewall for LGBT rights, and we have Pride today, Standing Rock, the March for Our Lives for gun control by young people, the 99% movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. It goes on and on and on. We are not finished. People have been telling us, and they keep telling us, that it is time for social change. And it's important to see these calls from the communities and from the movements from the perspective of collective positive intention versus collective negative intention. Not enough has moved yet. And every time we challenge injustices and call for changes in the structures that perpetuate injustice, we are saved. Now, let me say a little bit about that. I grew up as a Unitarian Universalist, and I identify as an agnostic humanist. And when I say that we are saved, it's because when someone else receives justice, a piece of our own humanity is restored too. We are saved. And the world actualized has a greater sense of peace in the unfolding of human potential. Justice matters to our own faith formation and our development as human beings. So we often hear about the gap between our aspirations and our lived reality. And the eighth principle calls us into practice in that gap. You values more fully. Rather than feeling that our work as individuals has been done, the eighth principle opens up a whole new realm of what there is to do. And it's in this new realm where our spiritual awakening and the revival of Unitarian Universalism can take place. The eighth principle helps to build a bridge between where we are now and what is possible for us in light of the beloved community that we talk about. This idea can sound kind of abstract in general. The eighth principle is still young, and it can be difficult to explain. Our congregations are adopting it. The latest one was just Sunday. I won't be surprised if I get a message today that someone else adopted it. But we're finally at a point where there are congregations that can give us an idea now of the benefits of having the eighth principle as part of the spiritual journey. The adoption started in 2017. This is not to say that what the eighth principle calls us to do is new. It's not. What is new is centering it in all that we do, and not just treating this work of justice and inclusion as social justice projects. We've been talking about transformation for years, but it has been somewhat elusive because for many people, it's hard to imagine what could be different, especially if church is working for you right now. So I want you to get that I'm not speaking alone. The people couldn't be here with you today, but I want to share with you what some ministers and some people of color have been saying about their experience with the eighth principle. And these come from conversations just recently had, December and January. And in February, we're going to hear from youth from 2 congregations. So you're welcome to come and participate in that. So Reverend Fitzgerald from Honolulu said, quote, "Some of my colleagues have been saying that they wish that Unitarian Universalism would come into its fullness of valuing all lives, but it hasn't. The eighth principle is an important theological statement that brings in the beloved community and anti-oppression language with a result as we talk about accountability and being in action. The blessing it has been to ministry, to my congregation, is that it is being incorporated in the different ways that people are beginning to think and act. So let me pause. If we thought that we were done, what we're hearing is people are getting a reset with the eighth principle. But he goes on to say it must be owned by the congregation. The ministers embody and proclaim the good news of the eighth principle, but it has to be owned by the congregation. He also said, quote, "If you want to attract people under 40, you should probably adopt the eighth principle. This is what people are talking about and what they want to see in their lives," end quote. So Reverend Crestwell from Maryland said, quote, "The world has changed. This is the dawning of a new age of consciousness, and we see it in our children. White supremacy has become overt. People of color are not just making this up. We all know it now. After the pandemic and the past administration, Unitarian Universalism is essentially behind. So where does that leave those of us who haven't even gotten to the eighth principle yet? The Unitarian Universalism that is going to thrive in the new age is going to be anti-racist. We've been waiting for this. And it's like all of a sudden the world just woke up. The change has already happened and we have to catch up," end quote. And Reverend Tanner from New Jersey, interesting, as she was about to speak, her daughter walked in the room and said something to her. And she said, I quote, "Hearing my daughter's voice centers it for me. We don't have any time to waste. We don't have another generation of children who are expendable, and we can't live as if we do. We come from a long line of heretics, and what heresy are we called to now? What are we called to proclaim? I think we should be doing everything we can to not only dismantle racism, but to also think about reconciliation and where we are going." And Reverend McKinley from Pennsylvania said, quote, "We're seeing an increase in the enjoyment in our services. If we think about this as a blank slate, how would we reimagine our community to have an eighth principle lens on everything that we do? What would our community look like on the other side of this pandemic? And this includes not just the diversity of people, but diversity in theological materials and music styles. If it is the norm, then diversity is what we will all have in common." Neat, huh? There is no roadmap for us to figure it out, and that's okay, end quote. And so some of the people of color, the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and people of color community, have also shared with us. Allison from Honolulu said, quote, "It makes a huge difference. If we're not going to deal with the eighth principle, then everything else that you tell me about the 7 principles is not ringing true. If I would consider moving from Hawaii, I would be looking for a Unitarian Universalist church that has the eighth principle, end quote. And Dorian from Maryland said, quote, I knew intuitively that I was loved in my congregation. But for them to adopt the eighth principle was a tangible expression of that love. Not only did they adopt the eighth principle, but they began immediately doing the work. It has given me a brand new congregation that I feel a part of, and it is my congregation. It has been magic for me, end quote. And Lutricia from North Carolina says, I'm a Unitarian Universalist because I really do believe in the principles and I try to live them. And the UU Church is where I have my best chance to do that. The eighth principle is hard work. If we were really practicing it, it would be transformative and it would change our relationships, not only to ourselves, but to our congregations and to our communities. I see the possibility, but it is not just a sweet little thing that we do that's. I'm not sure that we have developed the muscle that we need to make the eighth principle real and transformative. But I think if we did that work, it would change our reality in terms of how we see our world and how we live in it, end quote. Dr. King spoke to us 55 years ago, and our own people are speaking to us now at a time when this country needs and hopefully is about to undergo deep transformation. We will hear the voices of youth on February 24th, if you would like to join us. Our work, the work of liberal progressive churches, is to build strong, inclusive communities and to join with communities that are using the power of their collective, positive intention and action to help heal the wrongs and to correct some of the historic structures that perpetuate inequality and suffering. Our work is far from over. And given the way that this year began, we know that there's a sense of urgency about it. Given the beginning of a new administration, we breathe a sigh of relief and hopefully we will move forward with renewed commitment and faith to not sleep through this important time of social change, but to do our work intentionally to bend the arc of justice. For us, the eighth principle becomes even more significant because it is about how we will hold ourselves accountable for being people and churches free of the perpetual evils of historic injustice. And I want to close with Martin Luther King's words from his Ware lecture. Quote, the great question is, what do we do when we find ourselves in such a period? Certainly, the church has a great responsibility because when the church is true to its nature, it stands as a moral guardian of the community and of the society. It has always been the role of the church to broaden horizons and to challenge the status quo, end quote. And I close just by saying the words of the principle. Let us journey towards spiritual wholeness by building the multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and oppression in ourselves and our institutions. May it be so. Amen.